After the discovery of America, a race started between European colonizers to discover more and more land, to expand their empire and obtain economic and strategic advantage over one another. This colonialism was also driven by need to spread Christianity and make a more civilized world, whose standards were defined by Europeans and ignore the beliefs and values of indigenous peoples. After the American Revolution in 1783, colonizers, especially British, started to look for land to send convicts. Britain had transported about 50,000 convicts to the New World from 1718 to 1775 and was now searching for an alternative. Rather than going west, they started to go south, where they discovered Australia, which is a Latin word meaning south. The first European landing in Australia occurred in 1606 when Dutch navigator William Jalzoul arrived on the northern coast. In the same year, Spanish explorer Luis Vaz de Torres navigated Torres Strait. Other explorers from present-day Indonesia visited Australia's coast in subsequent years. In 1770, Lieutenant James Cook claimed the east coast of Australia for Great Britain after charting it during his voyage. He brought back accounts supporting colonization, particularly at Botany Bay, which is now part of Sydney. The first fleet of British ships arrived in Botany Bay in January 1788, establishing the first penal colony on Australian mainland. Penal colony is a distant overseas territory established for punishing criminals who by forced labor and isolation from society. The penal colony aimed to send convicts there to be self-sufficient and alleviate the burden on the British taxpayer. Over the next century, the British established additional colonies across the continent, while European explorers ventured into the interior. During this period, the Aboriginal population was severely affected by reduced diseases and conflicts with the colonists, resulting in a decline in their numbers. Before Europeans, two peoples are believed to be living in Australia, which are Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islanders. Aboriginals are believed to have arrived in Australia between 50,000 to 65,000 years ago. As hunters and gatherers, they developed idiotic spiritual and artistic traditions. Estimates of Aboriginal population at the time of British settlement ranged from 500,000 to 1 million individuals. Around 2,500 years ago, the first Torres Strait Islanders, distinct from Aboriginal peoples, arrived from present-day Papua New Guinea. They settled in the Torres Strait Islands and the Cape York Peninsula, located in northern part of Australia. The colony of New South Wales was established with the arrival of First Fleet in January 1788. It consisted of over 1,000 settlers, including convicts. They settled at Sydney Cove, later known as Sydney, on 26 January 1788, which became Australia's national day. The colony grew as military officers required land. Former convicts engaged in farming and trade, and industries such as boat building and sealing and whaling developed. After the Napoleonic Wars, the transportation of convicts to the fifth colony increased, and the number of free settlers also grew. From 1820, free settlers were encouraged to land grants and an influence of capital. It became a crown colony in 1842, and its economy recovered through wheat farming, sheep raising, and copper mining. Limited self-government was achieved in 1851 and with a partially elected legislative council. Between 1788 to 1868, approximately 161,000 convicts were transported to Australian colonies, with the majority being repeated offenders from working class towns in India. They brought back useful skills and contributed to the development of the new colony. The small number of free settlers meant that early governors had to rely on convicts and emancipists for various professions. What happened to the native stem? The arrival of British settlers had a significant impact on indigenous population. When the first fleet arrived, Aboriginal population in the Sydney region was estimated to be around 300 people, and an outbreak of smallpox in 1789 resulted of over death of 90% population. Conflict and disposition of land across arose due to settlers' assumptions of superiority and entitlement to the land they deemed improved through cultivation and breeding. In Van Diemen's Island, now called Tasmania, after 2 decades of squatters, as settlers' number and sheep raising expanded, martial law was declared and a black line was formed to drive Aboriginal population from settled areas. It is estimated that hundreds of both settlers and Aboriginal Tasmanians died during this period. Ultimately, the colonization process resulted in relocation of Aboriginal Tasmanians to the Torres Island, ultimately disposition and destruction of indigenous communities throughout Australia. Colonizers aimed to civilize and reclaim Aboriginal people from their barbarous practices. They established a native institution for Aboriginal children, settled Aboriginal families on farms and made land grants to Aboriginal people. However, these initiatives ultimately failed, and Aboriginal people continue to live on vacant waterfronts, waterfront lands, and the outskirts of Sydney. In the late 20s and 1830s, as per the corporate escalated, colonial governments implemented policies to protect Aboriginal people. Protectors distributed rations, provided education in the Ontario canopy, and offered training in occupation useful to the colonists. The protection offices were eventually closed due to costs failure the way codes. In more populated areas, Aboriginal people who had lost their land and lived on reserves, missions, or on outskirts of cities. In pastoral districts, the British Wasteland Act of 1848 granted limited rights to traditional landowners to live and gather food on the crown land under pastoral leases. Aboriginal groups often camp on pastoral stations, where Aboriginal men work as shepherds and stockmen, allowing them to maintain connection to the land and preserve aspects of their traditional culture. The stolen generation refers to thus capturing Australia's history when Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander race children were forcibly removed from their families and by Australian government and church missions between the late 1800s and 1970s. The policy aim was to assimilate indigenous children into white Australian society by separating them from their cultural heritage and identity. The removal was also seen as a way to dismantle indigenous culture, weaken the ties between indigenous communities. Many children were taken away from their families without their parents' consent, and in some cases by force. The children are often sent by tuition, sponsored families, or state-run institutions where they were subjected to strict and often hard treatment. Many suffered the uses neglect and loss of cultural identity and related connection with their communities. The consequences of stolen generation have been devastating and long-lasting. Many of those who were taken experienced trauma, loss, and a sense of cultural discrimination. The policy has had intergenerational impacts, affecting not only those who were taken by the fall, but also their descendants, as a trauma and selection from culture have been passed down through generations. In 1990s, a significant lesson known as Bringing Them Home report was concluded by Human Rights and Equal Opportunity Commission. The report revealed the extent of the forced removals and the impact on individual communities. It called for an official policy from the Australian government
for the pain, suffering and hurt of these stolen generations, their descendants and for their families left behind, we say sorry.
History is a controversial subject in Australia, with diverging viewpoints. One school of thought justifies colonialism and says that historians taught development, progress, and civilization to Australia, while another school of thought says that disposition of land, spread of diseases, violent conflicts, and forced removal of indigenous children from their families is equal to Holocaust and must be condemned. The legacy of history continues to shape contemporary Australia's society, as efforts towards reconciliation and acknowledging past injustices remains ongoing.